Just imagine that. Imagine the pressure.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Happy New Year to all of you. We are now in. Where is. Come on. Where is the recording? Trying to get to recording. It disappeared. Give me a second. Welcome on the stream. Recording was there and then it was gone, and there it is. So, welcome one and all. It is the 5th day of January. Happy New Year. You're listening to Global Affairs Unfiltered with me, Jack Stockwell. Wow, what's happened since I was on the air Wednesday? Major kidnapping, and I'm gonna talk about that. Then I want to talk about Kiev's attempt to try to assassinate Putin and what that's going to do with Zelensky's continuing madness, that he could possibly get a ceasefire, which is not going to happen in this universe. So, the breaking news, of course, over the weekend is that the U.S. military, under President Trump's command, had attacked Venezuela, kidnapped its president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. President Trump said, "The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement." That should scare you. Details to follow. Well, he got a better deal than Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi, that's for sure. But Trump claimed that the purpose of the raid was to bring Maduro and his wife to trial in the Southern District of New York on charges of drug trafficking. And in his hour-long press conference later in the day, from Mar-a-Lago, President Trump announced that the United States henceforth will be now the new rulers of Venezuela, and that the oil industry would also be seized, payment extracted for the 1976 nationalization of the oil sector, and that the U.S. was warning any and all countries that they're going to get the same treatment if they don't meet U.S. demands in full. So if you ever wondered at what point America would become the Roman Empire, and instead of a democratic republic, constitutional republic, it is now an imperial republic. So Trump went out of his way to further warn, quote, "Venezuela was increasingly hosting foreign adversaries in our region," evidently a reference to China and Russia and other nations. And that's what this is really about. What this is really about is not the oil, although that'll be, a nice spoil to the victor. It's about keeping Russia and China out of development in this hemisphere, and further weakening the power of BRICS, flooding the market with Venezuelan oil to help bolster up the dollar, because the Venezuelan oil, regardless of where it goes, and it'll end up going to some of the countries sanctioned because they deal with Russia. It'll be going back to China. There will be no interruption in the flow, but it will be bought by U.S. dollars. So I think it's highly significant that President Maduro had just recently met with a very high-level visiting Chinese delegation, including a personal envoy of President Xi Jinping, scarcely 5 hours before he was kidnapped. So Trump also announced that his Secretary of State, Rubio, had spoken by phone with Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez after the assault, and that she has taken over as president and was compliant, of course, and was promised to do whatsoever the U.S. asked of her. Boy, conquering a foreign nation. And then, apparently there were an awful lot of military people killed trying to protect their president. but it could have been a lot worse as far as death rates are concerned. But the reality, however, was that the Vice President Rodriguez convened a National Defense Council a little bit later in the day after the kidnapping and after the president was spirited out of Venezuela to a U.S. military ship on his way to New York, where apparently he is now in New York. In fact, I think he's going to be before the Southern District Court today. The vice president, in a nationwide TV broadcast in the presence of the top military leaders of the nation's legislative, judiciary, and military bodies, denounced the U.S. regime change, which was designed, of course, to seize Venezuela's resources, and that she stated as a body, we demand the immediate release of President Nicolas Maduro, the only president of Venezuela, and his wife, Celia Flor. So this rather brazen return to Teddy Roosevelt-style gunboat diplomacy was also met by a storm of international protests from Russia, China, Brazil, Mexico. So there's an emergency session of the UN Security Council that's been called to address this crisis. And in New York, it would be, 10 o'clock? So they're probably already getting together. The details to follow. I love it when I see that. This military operation per se included a 10-minute briefing from Chairman of U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, during Trump's midday press conference. Now, you remember, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs doesn't have military authority to do anything. It's just a figurehead position, showing some unanimity of the various branches of the services of the American military. General Dan Kane, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, doesn't tell generals underneath him what to do. There's already generals who take care of that stuff, especially the Southern Command out of Florida. It's kind of a figurehead position and represents, as I said, all the services and in their advice that they give to the president. Now, Kane gave an overview of the planning, preparation, and execution of what the military has called Operation Absolute Resolve. So he stressed the mission could not have gone forward without the incredible work of various intelligence agencies, including the CIA, the NSA, and the NGA. If you're not familiar with the NGA, it is the new National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. That ought to make you think for a second. So he said, quote, after months of work by our intelligence teammates to find Maduro and understand how he moved, where he lived, and where he traveled, what he ate, what he wore, what were his pets. In early December, our force was set pending a series of aligned events. The force package included over 150 aircraft launching from 20 different bases in the Western Hemisphere, including the assault ship, the USS Iwo Jima, just off the coast. The aircraft included helicopters carrying U.S. Special Forces, accompanied by FBI personnel, U.S. Air Force and Navy fighter jets, surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft, and B-1 bombers along with drones. Airstrikes took out air defenses in Caracas to protect the helicopters, and after Maduro and his wife surrendered, they were taken by helicopter to the USS Iwo Jima and are being transported, according to this news release, which is 2 days old, to the New York region. Well, what does the rest of the world have to say about this? who know they could be next? For any reason, there isn't any fentanyl coming out of Venezuela. The raw materials for fentanyl ends up in Mexico, and Mexico makes it. Fentanyl comes into the U.S. across the southern border from Mexico. Fentanyl does not come from Venezuela. And I don't know how many of these boats have been blown up now by our drone-driven bombs, but not one of them could possibly make the United States after having left Venezuelan waters. Anyway, China. This is China's foreign minister. China is deeply shocked by and strongly condemns the U.S.'s blatant use of force against a sovereign state and action against its president. Such hegemonic acts of the U.S. seriously violate international law, at Venezuela's sovereignty, and threaten peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean region. China firmly opposes it. To abide by international law and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and stop violating other countries' sovereignty and security. So, as I said, only hours before the U.S. military kidnapped him, Maduro had received a high-level delegation of Chinese officials at the Miraflores Palace, led by President Xi Jinping's special envoy. This is what they said: a fraternal encounter that reaffirms the strong ties of brotherhood and friendship between China and Venezuela, every test and every time. Now, the Foreign Ministry of Russia issued 4 statements on January 3rd in response to the bombing and the kidnapping, and in each, Russia condemned the U.S. acts of armed aggression against Venezuela, urged that any disagreements be resolved through dialogue. So the Russian Foreign Ministry said, the justifications put forward for these actions have no factual basis. Ideological hostility has prevailed over pragmatic, business-like approaches and over efforts to build relationships based on trust and predictability. Latin America must continue to remain a zone of peace, as it proclaimed itself in 2014 while Venezuela must be guaranteed the right to determine its own future. All right. Russia later expressed its condemnation of the fact that President Maduro and his wife have been forcibly flown out of the country, an unacceptable violation of the sovereignty of an independent state. Foreign Minister Lavrov spoke personally by telephone with the Venezuelan vice president to convey Russia's firm solidarity with the people of Venezuela confronting an armed aggression. Well, that solidarity didn't involve the Russian military, of course. So these statements from both governments were issued before President Trump proclaimed that the intention is for the United States to run the country of Venezuela. What does that mean? I just was watching the video feed here a while before I got on air. What does it mean to run the country of Venezuela? I think that's a rather bold statement to make. What he means is, Trump saying about the Venezuelan leader, she'll face consequences if she doesn't do what's right. And of course, what's right is simply turning over the Venezuelan oil to American oil industries. So who's lining up for that? I thought it was interesting that the local news this morning was making a big deal about how low gas prices are. The lowest prices since 2020 during the re-election campaign of Trump. And it just never ceases to crack me up. How many people believe this nonsense? There are a lot of people. I had a couple of conversations over the weekend with some people who had gotten in touch with me for my opinion of this, and I said, well, it's a kidnapping. And one of them got indignant. No, it had to be done to stop the flow of drugs. Come on. You got to do some more reading. You got to do some more research. It's not fentanyl. Yeah, but it was cocaine. The answer to cocaine coming into this country isn't bombing all the cocaine manufacturing spots in Colombia, because they'll just make another one. It's to enforce drug laws here in this country and to get the CIA out of the drug trade. Good luck with that. Well, if you thought the year 2025 was tumultuous and ridden with dangers and fraught with all these unbelievable things that we a year or two earlier did not imagine were possible, 2026 is just going to continue on like that, and promises it might be a year of even greater traumatic changes for the very simple reason that the whole strategic situation and many of the elements within it are stretched to the utmost, and that we have to expect certain things not to continue, but to go into disruptive developments, especially the Ukraine, especially when the Ukraine tries to assassinate the president of a nuclear-armed country. And then everything is going to depend on whether the forces of reason to prevent any one of these conflicts from going into global conflagration can actually occur. So I think the dominating new development this morning, well, actually it was over the weekend, it's interesting that this kidnapping took place right around, and I think it's incredible that it happens like this, around the drone attacks on the residence of President Putin in a little city near Novgorod in Valdai, where immediately following the discussions at Mar-a-Lago between Trump and Zelensky, there is this attack of 91 drones in the direction of the residence of Russian President Putin, which also happens to contain nearby a nuclear command center. And so, according to Russian military officials, all the drones were neutralized, no damage was inflicted, but the implication of this is absolutely of the highest strategic importance, because if President Putin would have been there, and if he would have been killed, the world would probably be in an open-ended spiral right now towards World War III already. And then the developments which occurred around this are equally hair-raising. First of all, the sequence of events was that President Putin did call President Trump and informed him of what had just happened. Trump's initial reaction was that he said that he was completely shocked and that he could not imagine that such an insane attack would even take place. Then the statement that was made by Putin was that in the face of a clear act of state terrorism, Russia has to reassess its position and that a Russian reaction is unavoidable. So I suppose Trump may have said, well, now, Vlad, calm down. They didn't kill you. It's okay. But Vlad comes back and says, we have a reaction to this, and it's unavoidable. Then Trump said, according to Yushakov, he said that unfortunately the U.S. did not give the Tomahawk. He said, fortunately, Vladimir, we have not given the Tomahawk missile to the Ukraine. Then naturally the Ukraine government dismissed and actually denied that this attack took place. They said that there was some attack against a military facility in the vicinity of the residence, but no attack on the residence was planned at all. Then naturally all the Western media only covered the Ukrainian version. I watched it through the weekend news. Every media outlet was covering the Ukrainian version that the attack did not happen. It's just Russia, Russia, Russia. And it was all made up, supposedly to get out of the peace process, which is a completely ridiculous argument, because Putin has already said that if the negotiations fail, which means if you don't accept our terms, we'll accomplish them by military means on the battlefield. So that left no doubt as to where the direction of this is going. And then in an absolutely dramatic development, the CIA, that is Mr. Ratcliffe and his organization of cronies, said that there was no attack. Even the CIA said there was no attack on the Russians. It was all made up by the Russians. Whereupon Scott Ritter, if you listen to him over the weekend, basically said that this is absolutely unbelievable. If you haven't seen the Ritter's clip on this, you can do a little search on YouTube. Ritter attack on Putin. Naturally, this has put Trump into a complete pickle because either the CIA was right or the Russians are right. And so Trump has to somehow make up his mind and find out. And because he didn't want to make up his mind too fast, oh, let's go grab Maduro. This is a good time to end the drug trade into the United States. Now, I know that you, as part of the K-Talk crowd, family, I should say, could see your way through this nonsense. This is a great move to stop the unifying power of the BRICS nations with the Western Hemisphere. Country after country, Venezuela was ready to completely join BRICS. BRICS does not deal in the petrodollar. BRICS nations do not buy their oil nor trade oil or other commodities in the U.S. dollar. China is currently dumping their U.S. treasuries. So the value of the dollar, the value of the stock market, the value of Bitcoin, it's going to be very interesting over the coming weeks as to what happens to those investment centers. So either the CIA is lying or the Russians are lying. What do the Russians have to gain about lying about this? Now, the interesting thing that supports the Russian point of view, Igor Kostyukov, director of the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, presented the evidence for this attack to the U.S. military attaché in Moscow, where they said they had got several of the drones that were shot down during the attack, which had their navigation systems well preserved in the drone, even though the drone was shot down. What can you discover from a navigation system? Well, what do we learn from the orange-colored box in downed commercial aircraft? Why do we have to get that little flight box out of and why is it so wrapped up in such a way that it can handle the deepest impacts in a plane crash so that you can get information out of it to find out what was going on with that airplane before it crashed? Well, they got the same thing in these drones. And in several of these drones, one could see not only the directionality, which was the route from where the drones were coming from, but you can also detect who was programming them. So this is now evidence which has been presented and therefore will be subject, obviously, to exact investigation, but it creates a very big problem for El Presidente Trump. Because, as I said, either the Russian evidence turns out to be true, which is one thing. Then the question is, did the CIA not know? Did they make a little mistake or slip of the tongue? Such things happen. Or did the CIA lie? In any case, it puts in front of President Trump the very urgent task of getting his house in order, for Pete's sake, and getting this clarified, because on this hangs the entire Ukraine negotiations. Because the entire question of this could be solved diplomatically, or not. But I don't think it looks very good right now, because the other thing that happened was that on New Year's Eve, exactly at 12 midnight, called the Sylvester in Germany after Pope Sylvester, there was an attack on a little town in Kherson called Korli, where civilians, families with children, no military significance whatsoever, at least not on any high-ranking level, were celebrating New Year's Eve and the beginning of the new year by watching President Putin's TV address to the nation. And while they were watching, there was a drone attack in the little town of Korli, which killed several dozen people, maybe 24 or more, injuring many, many more. And obviously, Kyiv immediately denied that they did it. How they can deny this is pretty difficult to imagine, but deny they did, so that what was then commented on by a wide range of Russian officials, where government spokeswoman Zakharova pointed to the fact of the absolute sadistic element of this, to target families celebrating the New Year, which has absolutely nothing to do with the conflict because they were civilians. And obviously, this is aggravating the situation to the hilt. Now, the international echo to all of these events has been very sharp. Naturally, China, Brazil, India, many other spokesmen, leaders of the global south took the position, as you might imagine, of Russia. The Western media, unisono, said this is a Russian invention. Maria Zakharova also noted the fact that the response by the Western forces to the attack on Corley was complete silence, saying there's been this long line of continuing condoning of terrorism committed by the Ukrainians. She says it's continued for many years, and it shows the absolute inhuman bias of Western forces in light of state terrorism. So this is an unbelievably serious situation, which isn't just going to disappear with the sun today as we come into a new day tomorrow, so that this also will disappear with the sunset. Just imagine for a moment if the attack had been successful and Russian President Putin would be dead by now. I can only venture to imagine how they would have exploded an already extremely tense strategic situation to the possible point of no return. So as I said, this isn't going to go away. It has to be investigated. It has to be clarified until the conclusions are drawn, and the world situation is going to be determined to some degree by that. But the Russian officials have delivered to the U.S. military attaché in Moscow the evidence, the downed drones with the navigation system, in some of them intact, that shows not only the direction from which it came, but who was flying it. Now, the news releases that I've looked at didn't go that far. Maybe that information hasn't been released, because you don't just launch a drone like a July 4th skyrocket and let it follow its own course, blow up, tantalize everybody with the optical delight of fireworks in the night as the ashes drift to the ground, hopefully going out before they hit the grass. They are guided. These aren't, when we say drones, we're not talking about the little drones that you can go over to Best Buy and buy and spy on your neighbor's backyard. We're talking about drones that have long range, hundreds of miles, that have to be guided using, in many cases, Elon Musk's satellite system, the star, whatever you call it, using his satellites, as well as European satellites, as well as American military satellites, and the GPS systems to guide these. Now, just to mention it, there's a lot of other crisis spots which unfortunately underline the fact that the strategic situation in the coming year is going to be one of absolute danger and turmoil. One of them is the situation in the Middle East, and it's getting more dangerous. Not only is the killing in Gaza and the West Bank continuing on, but also after the visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to Mar-a-Lago on the New Year, he was the only foreign guest there. Not that that's unusual, but I think that was his 6th trip to Mar-a-Lago this year, if I remember correctly. And the only foreign dignitary, if you want to call him that, to be at Mar-a-Lago on New Year's Day. And the likelihood that it will come to another military operation against Iran unfortunately, is very big. And obviously, this would really escalate the world into another absolute catastrophe. And then just this weekend around Venezuela, before the kidnapping, 5 more boats were shot to pieces. I think 100 more people were killed. And this situation absolutely remains one of the potential complete destabilization of the Latin American continent. The situation between China and Japan. That's when China and Japan join together, it will be called China. The situation between Japan and China remains absolutely intense, of course, following the Chinese military maneuvers around Taiwan that I explained last week, with Chinese warships encircling the island. And all of these crises underline the fact that the paradigm has got to change, to say the least. So when you look at what BRICS is doing, the Global South, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, trying to cooperate with the West, they're moving away from the American dollar, which the American financial situation teetering on the edge right now, the razor's edge. Can't afford to have any other major commodity dealing outside of the petrodollar. Now, I know of some military circles in European countries who are sort of halfway joking about what happened with Putin, halfway joking that they believe the Western account of the military situation on the ground in Ukraine, as opposed to the well-published, well-documented Russian position, documented by satellite photos, not the least of which. These people are still joking, cynically saying that this is what they're saying now. If the Russians only send the Oreshnik missiles, we'll be in good shape. But if they go nuclear, we're in bad shape. But thinking that it would be between those two. In other words, what they're not saying is we know that if this aggression continues, such as trying to kill the Russian president, they're going to send some more Oreshniks, not just the one they did a year and a half ago. But they're going to send some more. But if they're not nuclear tipped, that'll be bad enough. But if they're nuclear tipped, it's going to be really, really bad. This is what they're saying. Now, the thing which is absolutely disconcerting, I remember back in the 80s when there were these middle range missiles. Well, it was kind of the middle range missile crisis. There were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets back then who were completely aware that we there under Reagan were on the verge of World War III. I'm just time period, and I'm mentioning this in the way of time period. Nothing against Reagan. I think Reagan was doing everything he could to stop it. I remember some of those demonstrations. I remember demonstrations here in Salt Lake City. And even Helmut Schmidt, in his position as chancellor, was warning particularly about that danger. And so now you have the situation where the leaders of the European governments, of the so-called coalition of the willing, naturally the Brussels EU Commission, talking. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible how you can orchestrate a policy that is like dancing on the top of an apocalyptic volcano, where anything can go wrong. And I think the factor of miscalculation is becoming larger and larger. There are these crazy statements by some of the people in the EU about taking Kaliningrad. I mean, that would be an attack on Russian Federation, and the Russians have said so. And the fact that the warnings from Karaganov are not taken seriously. I mean, if you don't take that seriously, you know, I may not agree with the tactic that you have to put fear into the people, but he reacts to a situation which obviously means that there is a complete detachment from reality of what the strategic situation is and what these policies could lead to. I mean, if there would be some of these schizophrenics get more military control. So I got more I want to talk about. I just want to start the day off with that even though we're moving into a new year, we're moving into the 250th celebration of our own independence from the British Empire, that with their murdering Lincoln. Yeah, it was the British Empire that killed him because he refused to let the Bank of England have a foothold in the United States, among other things. But we're in a situation now where it looks like Trump can do anything he wants. Now, I voted for him. I voted for him because at the time I voted for him, I considered him less dangerous than the alternative. But you got to kind of wonder now. I did say during the middle of this previous year that had Harris won, we would probably already be knee-deep in World War III American blood being spilled. So far, that hasn't been the case. Apparently, even with all of the Venezuelan guard that were killed through bombing and other means trying to kidnap their president by American forces, no Americans were injured, or at least no serious casualties that I've heard of. But there are casualties in Congress. And this isn't being displayed as well as I thought it would be, because the congressional responses to President Trump's kidnapping of Maduro in the early morning of January 3rd, the responses by Congress are kind of falling into two categories. The Democrats ripped Trump for it, of course, mainly for not consulting Congress ahead of time. While the Republicans as a whole, well, that wasn't necessary. He didn't have to consult us. He's the chief of the military forces, the supreme commander, the emperor of the imperialist army. And because he's president, he can do it. And as Hegseth came out and said what he did is justified by Article 2, there's some people who believe that. There's some people who hear that Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, although he calls himself the Secretary of War, has essentially said, we can do what we want because we're America. And it's America's security that has to be secured. And we secure America's security against the ever-growing intrusive forces of China and Russia in this hemisphere by stealing the Venezuelan oil. Now, shortly after the U.S. launched the strikes in Venezuela, Democratic Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona said this on X: "This war is illegal." Now, he's a Marine Corps veteran who was deployed in Iraq. And he said, "This is the second unjustified war in my lifetime." Now, not everybody, of course, is referring to what happened in Venezuela as a war. Obviously, it was an act of war. It can only be a war if Venezuela responds. The Vice President, Rodriguez, said, "Hey, no more kidnapping. We'll do what you want." Then, as I said earlier in the show, she gave a nationwide broadcast that afternoon and said, "What's happened here is despicable. It was a kidnapping and we won't support it. President Trump says, you're going to support it or you're next. I'm sorry, is that ridiculous? Senator Andy Kim, Democrat from New Jersey, specifically called out Secretary of State Rubio and Defense Secretary Hegseth over the operation, pointing to remarks the officials made during briefings late last year that was reported on the Hill. Quote, Secretaries Rubio and Hegseth looked every senator in the eye a few weeks ago and said this wasn't about regime change. I didn't trust them then, and we see now that they blatantly lied to Congress. Trump rejected our constitutionally required approval process for armed conflict because the administration knows the American people overwhelmingly reject risks pulling our nation into another war. Representative Darren Soto, a Democrat from Florida, while praising Maduro's capture as a major step towards a free Venezuela, then out the other side of his mouth on X said, Trump's failure to seek congressional approval for these strikes raises serious questions about the legality of the mission. Representative Seth Moulton, Democrat from Maine, said, Congress did not authorize this war. Venezuela posed no imminent threat to the United States. Well, mind you, neither does Iran. That isn't going to stop our military. Like Kim, Soto also noted that top Trump officials had previously testified to Congress that the U.S. was not seeking to oust Maduro and would seek congressional authorization for any ground operation in Venezuela. Well, I guess you could argue that this wasn't a ground operation because they went in helicopters. It was an air operation. Of course, I'm being ridiculous. Many Republicans backed the president, with Senator Tom Cotton, a member of the Armed Forces Committee, calling for the Venezuelan leader to face justice for his crimes. Maduro wasn't just an illegitimate dictator. He also ran a vast drug trafficking operation. That's why he was indicted in U.S. court nearly 6 years ago for drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. Now, one good thing I can say about Senator Mike Lee of our great state initially expressed some serious skepticism about the legitimacy of this operation. But then he turned around after speaking to Rubio, who told him that Maduro had been arrested by U.S. personnel to stand trial on criminal charges in the United States, and that the kinetic action we saw tonight was deployed to protect and defend those executing the arrest warrant. Now listen to that. That's what Senator Lee is saying. Trying to get legally technical here. It was the kinetic action. The kidnapping is a kinetic action that was required to execute the arrest warrant. If I'm subject to arrest because of a warrant given on affidavit that somehow I've done something wrong, and I am here in my domicile as I am this morning, and there's a knock at the door, and they say we have a warrant for your arrest. It's at this point you stop fighting, you open the door, you turn around, put your hands behind you to be handcuffed, and peaceably go along so that you don't increase the charges against you for resisting. But if you're a citizen of another country, and a court in this country puts out an arrest warrant for a citizen of another country, then you go into that other country with your military, extract him out through kinetic action, as Senator Lee says, to execute the arrest warrant. What's really going on here? So when Lee was questioned about this, Senator Lee said, this action likely falls within the President's inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to protect U.S. personnel from an actual or imminent attack. Well, I would like to have Senator Lee on here this morning. What was the actual or imminent attack from Venezuela against the mighty nation of the United States of America that would justify what happened? What was the actual or imminent attack? Tren de Agua? Well, I've got several other people here with their denunciation of what happened. I think that it's very clear. Oh, here's something that was interesting. Ukraine's chief of assassinations is now saying it's time for serious negotiations with Russia. That means that the ceasefire talks up to this point, according to the Ministry of Assassination, called the Military Intelligence Directorate, Budanov, I've talked about Budanov enough, you know about it, the Director of Assassinations, that has almost the entire lineup on Judge Napolitano's podcast every week on their assassination list, has come out and says now it's time for serious negotiations. In other words, obviously, the Russians are not going to sit down and talk about a ceasefire. The Russians have made that very clear. As the Russians are advancing kilometers every single day, cities, towns, hamlets, villages being liberated every day as they move closer to Zaporizhia. Budanov asserted that the key to Russia's success has been their relentless pursuing of the offensive and maintaining its pace. In other words, they're kicking our ass. But if we want any ass left, we better sit down and talk to these people. He said, I'll tell you again, the Russian Federation is not going to stop its offensive. They are succeeding. And are not enough people, everybody knows it, for the Ukrainian defense. When he was asked if this was totally the Russian achievement or help from North Korea or Iran, he said, these are the Russian achievements and nobody else's. He was asked, is it worth negotiating with a country that wants our destruction? He said, and Russia doesn't want their destruction. Russia wants the offensive on the part of Ukraine to stop for an addition to the Ukrainian constitution that says they will not join NATO, for the Ukraine to demilitarize down to a force of 80,000 troops, not the 800,000 troops that Zelensky demands. And that the Nazis in the Kyiv government are removed. That's all they asked for. So, when Budanov was asked, do you want to sit down and negotiate with a country that wants our destruction? It's not like you're sitting there with something to offer. You have no cards to play. So Budanov says, I'll say it again, the negotiation process is necessary, but the formula for guaranteeing a good and more effective, acceptable result in the negotiation process is the principle of silence. In other words, shut up. You're only hurting our position by demanding the Russians make certain concessions. Then he went on in the interview. And when he asking about the weaker position that the Ukraine has, he said, the weaker side has never dictated conditions to anyone and will not do so. To dictate terms, you only need to be strong. But is the Ukraine stronger than Russia? Politically, financially, economically, industrially, scientifically, militarily, or religiously, then he said that's exactly what Trump is talking about, and I understand his logic. Where Trump has made comments to the effect, when he said to Zelensky, you have no cards to play. So now, the chief of the Military Intelligence Directorate, Kirill Budanov, head of the Office of the President's position, that was vacated by Yermak during November's scandals, has said it's time to sit down and talk to these people. All right. So 2 days ago, Russia actually handed over to the United States the physical evidence, as I said, of the downed Ukrainian drone, showing that it had been programmed to hit the complex of buildings at President Putin's residence in Novgorod early on the morning of December 29th. And the hope was that a cold bath of reality would touch the better angle of Trump's nature, so that he'd be able to reflect on who was lying to him and who was dealing with him openly. Because, as I said earlier, either the CIA is lying or the Russians are lying. And the Russians, to repeat myself because it's important, delivered the navigation material of these downed drones to the U.S. military attaché in Moscow. You look at them. Tell me if I'm wrong. Then immediately, December 29th through January 1st, all the chatter in the Western media that it was clear that Moscow had simply invented the story, that Moscow had no proof, that no one could believe anything that Moscow says, and then all of a sudden the chatter disappeared. Because Western media had simply lost interest. No calls for U.S. intelligence agencies to examine the evidence. No retractions for groundless assertions. Certainly no apologies by Western intelligence. And remember that on December 28th, 29th, over that night, Trump had confronted Ukraine's acting president. He's not legally the president, except under declaration of martial law, that this May will be 2 years. That Trump had confronted Zelensky with the necessity of yielding the Donbass regions that had voted overwhelmingly back in 2022 to join the Russian Federation, an area that Moscow had vowed to clear of foreign soldiers. So at that point, what basis did Zelensky think he had for rejecting the peace deal? I mean, how could his course of action during that time with Trump not have been connected to Ukraine's launching of those 91 drone missiles at Putin's residence? And then what happened? What happened right after that? Trump talks to Putin, expresses his anger over the drone assault, even though his own CIA chief Ratcliffe told him it was Russian propaganda. Trump expresses his anger at that drone attack. Later that day, when pressed by the media that there may not have been any attack, as Zelensky had expressly denied the attack, Trump admitted such a conspiracy theory was possible, but he expressed confidence in what Putin told him. And then the deviltry escalated over December 30, 31, Tuesday into Wednesday last week. And amidst all of the verbal assaults on Moscow for making up the story, Trump was assaulted by rump factions, I don't know what else to call them, in the U.S. intelligence community, not dissimilar to the December 2016, January 2017 Russia Gate bull manookie. Recall that Trump capitulated on the firing of his chosen national security advisor, Michael Flynn, and then he played defense from then on. Has Trump learned anything from that 8 years later? 9 years later? Who's he going to listen to? On the phone, talking to Putin, very upset about what has happened. Then his own intelligence chief, Ratcliffe, says it's made up by the Russians. Then on Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal reported, based upon one unnamed official who wasn't in the meeting, that the CIA had briefed Trump that there never was a drone assault targeting Putin's residence. Then the Wall Street Journal asked the CIA to confirm their story, but they refused to do so. And then the media barrage accelerated. They all knew that the CIA had determined were they going to support it or not. Then on Thursday afternoon, January 1st, New Year's Day, in Moscow, a U.S. military attaché received the actual physical evidence. Now, would not that backside faction among the U.S. intelligence agencies, exposed on their lie, come forward? No. The in-place plans to assault Venezuela and kidnap President Maduro were activated, and 36 to 48 hours later, the United States is plunged into a Teddy Roosevelt bully-type attitude, except this time on steroids. Naked looting of the colonies will submit voluntarily, so we're going to go get them, while lying to beat the band and accompanied by a bunch of chest thumping, not the least of which was President Trump himself. Secretary of War President Pete Hegseth explained on January 3rd that it would be like the foolish regime change disaster of 2003 in Iraq, except that Trump had flipped the script by designing a regime change with a business model that can turn the whole thing into a profit, unlike what happened with Iraq under George W. This is not exaggeration. This is not hyperbole. It is naked, unapologetic addiction to looting with a positive twist. Now, we all know some decent people in our communities whose selfishness and insecurities sometimes get the better of them. I think it's unfortunate the mark of bankruptcy and political discussion, so-called leadership in the West, agrees. There's this willingness to step on the back of one's neighbor when they're down, and lust for the perpetuation of your own fantasy world, which is the primary directive and dominating force behind Western culture. But the stampede is on now. The nakedly greedy crowd has gotten President Trump to have a wild night out, solving problems by Teddy Roosevelt's vigilante methods. And the lust and the salivating have broken out. Because what's next? Take down Cuba. Take down Iran. Then Russia. Then China. Kind of like a Rambo movie. So today, the UN Security Council is holding an emergency session on Venezuela. Anyone who harbors any doubt as to whether the so-called serving of an arrest warrant on a foreign head of state, much less kidnapping them and deporting them, has any standing whatsoever under international law, I think will certainly be disabused of the pablum. But more is needed as the world has recoiled in horror over the January 3rd kidnapping of a head of state, which apparently dozens, of Maduro's security personnel were killed as they watched President Trump and his ongoing Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde character of America. I don't know. I sometimes think President Trump is waking up, and other times I think he's been lulled back to sleep by the forces of the neocons who obviously have control of the White House. All right. Hey, we had such a good response to the half off thing, and there are people who are calling the office. We missed it. We missed it. We were out of town vacation. So we're going to continue this a little bit longer. If you need me to take care of you, and I can cite a lot of different people I've seen in the last week or so that came in with symptoms you would not necessarily think that I would be addressing in my clinic. Serious neurological problems, all with good outcomes. You can call 801-523-1890 for a no-cost consultation. And I'll still take care of the K-Talk crowd at half price for a little bit longer. You can go to jackstockwell.com and sign up online for a consultation. Again, there's no charge unless you want me to take care of it. So I guess this is going to be it. You know what? I don't know that I ever started the recording. I need to check that. For those of you, I did. I'm going to stop the recording and save that under today's date. I'm going to put back on what was on there before I got on air. For those of you on the stream, if you like and subscribe, it'll help improve our numbers. Share this if you thought it had any value to anybody else. And I will